The job ad didn't seem real. It was simple enough, just a short line that read, "Caretaker needed for an abandoned zoo. Room and board provided. Must be willing to work odd hours." It was posted on one of those obscure job boards that seem to pop up every now and then, and I thought it was a joke at first. Who in their right mind would want to work at an abandoned zoo? But when I saw the pay, well, above average for something that didn't require much experience, it piqued my curiosity. The ad didn't have any contact information, only an address, the Everwood Zoo, a place I'd never heard of. I wasn't sure why I was drawn to it. Maybe it was the idea of working in a place so unusual. Maybe it was the desperation, the need for something different. But whatever the reason, I felt compelled to apply. A week later, I received a call. A man named Carl, the owner of the zoo, explained the job to me in a clipped, businesslike tone. He was direct, but there was something odd about the way he spoke. His words were carefully measured, and his voice always had a sense of urgency, even when he wasn't saying anything important. "Everwood Zoo has been closed for years," Carl told me. "We need someone to look after the grounds, do a little maintenance, feed the animals, and just keep things in order. No one's really visited in a long time, but I think it's time to reopen." I could sense that he wasn't being entirely honest. The zoo was abandoned. It had been closed for over a decade, and I'd never heard anything about it in the news or on social media. And yet, here was Carl, talking like reopening it was a foregone conclusion. Still, I was intrigued. The pay was good, and frankly, I needed the money. The only condition he mentioned was that the caretaker would live on the premises. The zoo itself was far off the beaten path, located on the outskirts of a small town. No neighbors, no distractions, just me, the zoo, and the animals. I accepted. The drive there was long and tedious, but nothing particularly strange stood out. The road was winding, surrounded by thick trees that created a canopy above me. I passed a few rundown houses along the way, but there was no sign of any real community, just the quiet isolation of rural life. When I finally arrived at the zoo, I was immediately struck by how overgrown everything was. The entrance was nearly hidden behind thick ivy, the old gates rusted and creaking in the wind. The main building, what I assumed to be the administrative offices, was in a state of decay, windows boarded up, paint peeling off the walls. The zoo had clearly been forgotten by the world. The only life that seemed to remain was the creeping vegetation and the strange, oppressive silence that hung in the air. I parked my car by the entrance and stood for a moment, taking in the scene. It was a large zoo, sprawling and isolated, with what looked like overgrown paths leading to various enclosures and cages. I could make out shapes moving within some of the enclosures, but I couldn't quite tell what they were. My breath caught in my throat. The place felt abandoned, and yet something about it made me feel uneasy, like I was being watched. Carl met me at the entrance, his face thin and angular, his eyes sharp. He led me to a small caretaker's cabin on the edge of the property. It was simple, just a single room with a small bed, a desk, and a kitchenette, but it was comfortable enough for the job. Carl seemed in a hurry, though, not offering much in the way of conversation. He handed me a set of keys and gave me a brief rundown of the animals I'd be looking after. "There's a few animals still here. Some lions, tigers, some smaller animals like monkeys and birds," he explained. "Feed them once in the morning. Check the enclosures in the evening. You can rest whenever, but the animals need to be fed on time. No exceptions." I nodded, unsure what to make of his lack of enthusiasm. It felt strange. He was eager enough to get me to the zoo, but he was distant, almost anxious once we arrived. And then, just as abruptly as he'd appeared, Carl handed me a notebook with some instructions on it and said he'd be back in a few weeks to check on things. "I'll be in touch," he said. "Just keep the animals fed and keep an eye on the grounds." And with that, he left. I was alone. Alone in a place that felt as if it had been forgotten by the world. The weight of the silence pressed down on me. The zoo seemed alive, but not in the way I was used to. It felt like the animals, the land, the very air had been waiting for something, or someone, to wake them up again. That night, after I had settled into the cabin and made a simple dinner, I decided to take my first walk around the zoo. I wanted to get a sense of the place, to figure out what I was working with. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows over the cages and pathways. As I walked through the zoo, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle at first, just a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, but the further I went, the more intense it became. I stopped a few times and looked around, but there was nothing. Just the rustling of leaves in the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. It was as if the zoo itself was alive, waiting for something. I eventually made my way to the big cat enclosures, the lions and tigers. The cages were large and well maintained, but the animals inside were staring at me, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight. The lions were still, but the tigers paced restlessly, their movements fluid, almost predatory. I took a step closer to the enclosure, feeling an inexplicable draw toward the animals. Their eyes never left me, following my every movement. I couldn't help but feel like they knew something I didn't. Something about them seemed aware. And then, from one of the other cages, I heard a low growl. It wasn't from the big cats. It came from something smaller, something hidden deeper in the shadows. I turned quickly, heart racing. The growl was followed by a strange noise, like something scratching against metal. I was about to move toward the sound when I stopped. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly, appeared in the dark corner of the zoo. I wasn't sure what I was seeing, but something inside me screamed that I wasn't alone. The animals were watching. The pair of glowing eyes in the shadows haunted me as I stood frozen in place. The growl I'd heard earlier still echoed in my mind, its low, guttural sound unsettlingly real, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood motionless, staring at the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. The eyes, two small, gleaming dots, seemed to be watching me, waiting. I could feel a strange tension in the air, a kind of unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I directed the beam toward the corner of the zoo. The light caught the dark shape of a cage, its bars rusted with age. Inside, a large, shaggy form shifted. Something huge, crouched low in the darkness. I could barely make it out, but I knew it wasn't one of the usual animals. It was something different, something wild. The flashlight's beam flickered for a second, as if responding to the tension in the air, and I quickly switched it off, hoping to avoid drawing attention. The creature, or whatever it was, seemed to be aware of me, its eyes glowing even brighter in the dark. The growl from earlier came again, louder this time, and it sent a chill down my spine. The sound wasn't just a warning. It felt like a promise. I turned and began to walk quickly back toward the path that led to my cabin. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I glanced back, certain that I could feel the creature's gaze still following me. The heavy silence around me was unbearable. broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the faint sound of the wind. The zoo, though abandoned for years, felt alive. Alive in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the animals that seemed to be aware of me. The very air felt charged, as if something unseen was watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I reached my cabin and slammed the door behind me, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I locked the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even inside the small, dimly lit room. The weight of the silence was suffocating, and my mind raced with questions. What had I just seen in the zoo? What was in that cage? Why did it feel like I was being watched by something more than just the animals? I couldn't stay in the cabin, not with the unease gnawing at me, so I decided to take a few moments to calm down. I grabbed a jacket and stepped back outside, hoping that some fresh air would help clear my head. The night had grown colder, and the moon cast long, twisted shadows across the zoo grounds. I made my way back to the animal enclosures, hoping to find some sense of normalcy in the familiar surroundings. The tigers and lions were still there, pacing restlessly in their cages, but the eyes I had seen earlier were gone. Or so I thought. As I walked through the zoo, something felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, thicker. The wind had died down, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. The only sound was the occasional rustle from the trees and the soft padding of my footsteps on the gravel path. But then, just as I passed the big cat enclosures, I heard it again. The low, ominous growl. I froze, my heart sinking. The sound was unmistakable this time, closer, louder, and it wasn't just one animal. There were several growls coming from different directions. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I felt it. Something was moving. Something was stalking me. The growls grew more insistent, almost like a warning. I hurried past the cages, my eyes darting to each one. The animals inside seemed to be watching me, but they weren't the source of the noise. Number. The growls were coming from deeper in the zoo, from the far corner where the abandoned enclosures sat. The air around me grew thicker again, like the atmosphere itself was closing in. I tried to push forward, but my legs felt heavy, as if something invisible was holding me back. And then I saw them. A pair of eyes, this time much closer, glowing faintly in the dark, not unlike the ones I had seen earlier. But this time, the shape they belonged to was clear. A large figure hunched low to the ground, moving silently through the shadows. Its body was massive, and the muscles in its back rippled as it moved toward me. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a shiver run through my spine. The growl from earlier came again, louder and more distinct, but it wasn't threatening. It was communicating. I was standing too still, too unaware. I didn't belong here, in this part of the zoo, in the shadow of this creature. It was as if the zoo itself was sending a message. You shouldn't be here. You are intruding. I took a step back, but the creature didn't move. Its gaze never left me. The air around me felt dense, suffocating, as if something was watching me from the darkness, waiting for me to react. And then, without a sound, the creature stepped back into the shadows, its glowing eyes the last thing I saw before it disappeared. My heart was racing, and I could feel my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I had no idea what that was, but I knew it wasn't just another animal. It was something else, something far more dangerous. I turned and quickly made my way back to the cabin, this time not stopping to look back. As I reached the door, I glanced over my shoulder once more. The zoo, the animals, the shadows, they were all silent now. But the unease didn't leave. The creatures in the zoo weren't just watching, they were waiting for something. I closed the door behind me, locking it for the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that the zoo wasn't just abandoned. It was alive, and whatever presence was watching me had its own rules. And those rules weren't meant for me. The night passed uneasily. The wind had picked up again, but this time it carried an ominous, unsettling sound, like a whisper just out of reach. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The zoo, despite being abandoned, didn't feel empty. It felt alive, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I spent the rest of the night pacing around my cabin, trying to calm myself. The growls and eyes I had encountered earlier lingered in my mind, replaying in vivid detail. The animals, the lions, the tigers, the creatures I had seen moving in the dark, were watching me. Yes, but something told me they weren't the only things in the zoo that were awake. I couldn't stay in that cabin, hiding from the unsettling energy in the air. The next morning, I set out to continue my work, feeding the animals, checking their enclosures, and making sure the zoo remained as orderly as possible. I felt an odd sense of dread as I walked past the enclosures, though. It wasn't the usual feeling of responsibility I had when working with animals. It was something more primal, like I was being watched by something that wasn't supposed to be there. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the atmosphere, the loneliness of the place. After all, abandoned places had a way of making you feel things that weren't there. As the day wore on, I made my way to the back of the zoo, to the smaller enclosures. These were the ones that seemed to have been left untouched for years. The fences were rusted, the cages overgrown with weeds and vines, and the structures themselves seemed on the verge of collapse. Yet, despite the decay, the place felt unsettlingly alive. When I reached the back of the zoo, I noticed something new. There were fresh tracks in the dirt, deep and wide. These weren't the typical animal tracks I was used to seeing. These were larger, more human-like. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that they were leading into one of the old abandoned enclosures. I followed the tracks cautiously, my breath catching in my throat. As I approached the cage, I saw that the door had been pushed open. The heavy rusted bars were bent, twisted as if something large had forced its way through. I stepped inside, my flashlight casting weak beams of light across the enclosure. The ground was trampled, and there was an unmistakable scent, something metallic and sweet, like the aftermath of a fresh kill. I scanned the area carefully, half expecting the creature I had seen the night before to be lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the wreckage of what seemed like an old pen and the oppressive silence. As I walked deeper into the enclosure, I heard it again. The soft padding of feet against the ground, followed by the faintest growl. This time, it was closer. Too close. I froze, my heart racing. I slowly turned my head toward the source of the sound. There, standing in the far corner of the enclosure, was a large figure. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, those same glowing eyes I had seen the night before. But this time, it wasn't just the shadowy figure I had seen before. It was bigger, its form clearer, as though it had materialized from the shadows. The creature was tall and muscular, its fur matted and dark, but there was something wrong about it. Its eyes weren't just animalistic, they were intelligent, calculating, almost human in their awareness. My breath caught in my throat. It was watching me again, its gaze piercing, as though it knew exactly what I was thinking. I took a step back, but the creature didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I could feel my legs turn into jelly, my mind screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. A low growl rumbled from deep within the creature's chest. It wasn't an aggressive growl. It was more like a warning, a reminder. It took a slow step forward, the muscles in its body rippling with each movement, and my pulse quickened. "Stay back," I whispered, more to myself than to the creature. But it didn't listen. It took another step, and I felt the ground tremble beneath me, as though the very earth was reacting to its presence. Suddenly, the growl deepened into something more unsettling, a sound that reverberated through the air, vibrating in my chest. It wasn't just a warning anymore, it was a command, and I obeyed. Without thinking, I turned and bolted out of the cage, running as fast as I could. The creature didn't chase me. At least, I didn't hear it following. But I didn't dare look back. The feeling of being watched stayed with me as I sprinted back to the main zoo grounds. The tracks, the broken gate, the growls, all of it felt like a warning, like something was waking up in this zoo, and I had disturbed it. I reached the caretaker's cabin and slammed the door shut behind me, leaning against it, trying to catch my breath. The oppressive weight of the silence around me felt suffocating. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like the zoo itself had become a predator, hunting me, watching my every move. The animals weren't just animals anymore. They were something else. The whispers, the glowing eyes, the growls, it all made sense now. This place wasn't abandoned. It was alive in a way I hadn't understood until now. I had thought that the zoo was simply a forgotten relic, but it was clear that it was more than that. The animals weren't just in their cages, they were watching, waiting, and whatever force controlled this place was slowly waking up, feeding off the fear and curiosity I had brought with me. And I had just become part of its game. The day dragged on in a blur of unease, my every step shadowed by the knowledge that something in the zoo had changed. I had thought I was simply the caretaker of a forgotten zoo, a job that would offer me some quiet and solitude, but now I realized the animals here were not just part of the zoo's past. They were part of its present, and their watching eyes were just the beginning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something far beyond the creatures in their cages. The zoo felt less like a place I was maintaining and more like a space that was maintaining me. Each step I took seemed to echo in the silence, and each time I glanced at the enclosures I felt as though the eyes of the animals were tracking my every move. That night, I tried to settle down, hoping to get some rest after the unsettling events of the day. But sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts kept racing, replaying the growls, the shadows in the corner of the cages, and the chill inside of those glowing eyes. It felt as though the zoo itself was alive, breathing with an energy I couldn't understand. I had heard of places being haunted by the spirits of their past, but this was something different. This was something living, something that had been hidden away for too long. I couldn't stand the silence any longer. I needed answers, and I needed to see what was really going on in the zoo. After pacing in my cabin for what felt like hours, I grabbed my flashlight and headed back to the enclosures. The air outside was cool, and the moon hung heavy in the sky, casting long shadows over the zoo grounds. As I made my way to the back of the zoo, I noticed the same disturbing signs as before. The overgrown paths, the rusted gates, the broken fences. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The air felt charged, as if something was waiting, something ready to spring to life. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn toward something I shouldn't be. I reached the enclosure where I had seen the creature earlier, the one with the glowing eyes. The gate was still ajar, but there was no sign of the creature. My flashlight flickered as I stepped closer, the beam illuminating the empty cage. The soil was disturbed, but the creature was nowhere to be found. Still, the air felt heavy, thick with an invisible presence. It was as though something was still here, watching me from the shadows. I moved past the empty enclosure, my flashlight sweeping across the ground. That's when I saw it. A faint set of tracks, not unlike the ones I had seen earlier, leading deeper into the zoo. They weren't animal tracks this time. These were human. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tracks were large, deep, and fresh, as though someone had walked through the zoo recently. But there were no other signs of life. No footprints, no sound, just the eerie quiet of the zoo at night. I followed the tracks cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The path led me to a section of the zoo I hadn't yet explored, an old building on the edge of the property, its windows dark and shattered. It looked abandoned, just like the rest of the zoo, but there was something about it that drew me in. The tracks stopped at the door, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I had to know what was inside. I pushed open the door with a creak, the hinges protesting against the stillness. The building smelled musty, the air thick with mildew and the scent of old wood. As I stepped inside, I swept the flashlight across the room. It looked like a storage area, a place for old equipment and supplies, but something felt off. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift and the temperature dropped noticeably. I moved further into the room, my eyes scanning the clutter. There were old crates and barrels, long since abandoned, their contents hidden behind rotting wood. But then I saw it, something that stopped me dead in my tracks. In the center of the room, beneath a dusty tarp, was a large wooden crate. It was old, its surface covered in strange symbols carved into the wood. The symbols were unlike anything I had ever seen before. They seemed almost alive, shifting subtly as I stared at them. I moved closer, my heart racing. The crate was heavy, but I managed to lift the tarp, revealing what was inside. It was a series of bones, human bones, carefully arranged as though they had been placed there with purpose. But it wasn't just a pile of bones. Some of them had been altered, their shapes twisted and warped, as if they had been reshaped. I took a step back, my mind racing. What was this? Who had left this here? And why? I could feel the presence of something watching me again, closer this time, almost on top of me. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard it. A soft, low growl. It was coming from the shadows, from the very heart of the zoo. It wasn't the same growl I had heard before. This one was deeper, more guttural. It was coming from something much larger. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what I had uncovered, but it wasn't just the animals I had to worry about anymore. The zoo had a secret, one far darker than I could have ever imagined. And whatever was in that room, whatever I had disturbed, was not going to let me leave. I reached the door, but as I stepped into the light, I heard the growl again. This time, closer. I wasn't alone. I ran. I didn't look back. My mind was spinning with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The growl I had heard, the strange symbols carved into the crate, the bones arranged with such meticulous care, it was all too much to process. The zoo, which had already been a place of eerie isolation, now felt like a tomb, and I was its unwilling occupant. My feet pounded against the gravel path as I sprinted toward the main gate. The growl was still echoing in my mind, and I could feel something following me, something close, just beyond my reach. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence, the air around me thick with an oppressive weight. I reached the entrance, but just as I grabbed for the gate, something stopped me. The lock. It was gone. The gate stood wide open, the heavy metal bars swaying slightly in the wind. I stood there, frozen for a moment, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. How had it opened? I was certain it had been locked when I arrived. My thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. Behind me, I heard it again. The growl. Louder this time, more distinct. It was coming closer, like the predator that had been patiently waiting for its prey. I didn't need to turn around to know something was there. I could feel the ground beneath my feet tremble, as if something large was moving through the shadows, closing in on me. I ran. I didn't stop to think. The air burned in my lungs as I tore down the path toward the caretaker's cabin. I could hear the heavy footsteps behind me now, the sound growing louder with each stride. I glanced back for a second, and that was all it took to confirm my worst fear. The shadowy figure from the cages, the glowing eyes, was following me. But it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had form, shape, movement. A massive, hulking creature, its eyes glowing like embers, its teeth sharp and unnaturally long. I could barely make out the details, but I could feel the sheer malice radiating from it, filling the air with a suffocating sense of dread. I reached the cabin and slammed the door shut behind me. The small wooden structure shook as something heavy slammed against it from the outside, sending vibrations through the walls. I quickly locked the door, my hands shaking as I did so. The room was cold now, colder than it had been, and the air felt thick with the oppressive weight of something ancient. I stumbled back into the corner of the cabin, pressing my back against the wall, trying to catch my breath. I could hear the creature pacing outside, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. It knew I was inside. It was waiting for me. I reached for the small flashlight on the table, flicking it on. Its weak beam cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the walls. I moved toward the small desk where I'd been working earlier, hoping for some clue, some answer to explain what was happening. As I rifled through the papers, I came across something that made my blood run cold. A map of the zoo grounds. The map was old, its edges frayed and yellowed, but it was clear enough. There were marked areas, animal enclosures, maintenance buildings, and something else. At the far end of the zoo, tucked away behind the main grounds, there was a symbol, similar to the one I had seen in the hidden room. A warning, written in old, faded ink. Do not disturb. I stared at the map for a long moment, the words echoing in my mind. The creature, the growl, the strange events, it all pointed to this hidden section of the zoo. It wasn't just an abandoned zoo, it was a holding place. A prison, perhaps, for something far darker than the animals I had been taking care of. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to face whatever had been buried in this place for so long. But the truth was undeniable. The animals, the creatures I had seen, none of it was natural. It wasn't just an abandoned zoo, it was a containment zone. I moved to the window and peered outside, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The creature was gone. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, but I knew it wasn't truly gone. It was out there, waiting. The map showed a small locked building near the edge of the zoo. It wasn't part of the public grounds. It was hidden away, almost as if it was intentionally kept secret. I had to go there. I had to see what had been hidden. The answers I was looking for were in that building, and I knew the creature wouldn't let me leave until I uncovered them. I grabbed a flashlight, tucked it into my coat, and made my way to the door. My heart was pounding in my chest, the weight of the decision pressing down on me, but I knew I had no choice. I had awakened something, and I had to face it. I opened the door slowly, scanning the darkness outside. The zoo was still, but it felt different now. It wasn't just abandoned. It was alive with the weight of something old, something that had been waiting. The shadows were deeper now, stretching into the corners of my vision as I made my way through the overgrown paths. The building loomed ahead of me, its doors closed tight, but I could sense that it was waiting for me. It had always been waiting. I stepped closer, my footsteps heavy on the gravel, and as I reached the door, I heard it again. The low growl. The creature was near. I reached the door to the hidden building, my hand hovering over the cold, rusted handle. The growl was louder now, more distinct, almost like a low rumble vibrating through the ground beneath me. The creature, whatever it was close, too close, but I couldn't stop. The truth, the answers I needed to understand what was happening, were locked behind that door. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. A wave of stale, musty air hit me, and I squinted in the dim light that filtered through cracks in the walls. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, the faint outline of shelves and old decaying equipment barely visible in the shadows. The air was thick with the scent of decay, like something had been left to rot for far too long. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and for a moment, the sound of my footsteps was the only thing that could be heard. The growl from outside had stopped, but the air felt charged, as though something was waiting, something ready to spring into action. The flashlight flickered in my hand as I moved deeper into the room. My eyes scanned the shelves, the tools, the forgotten remnants of the zoo's past. There were cages stacked against the walls, strange and unfamiliar in design. My pulse quickened as I passed them, each one filled with a different kind of terror. Some were empty, others broken, but all of them seemed to be part of something darker, a forgotten history of whatever this zoo had been hiding. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room was a large iron door, heavily rusted and locked. The door looked out of place, too modern, too heavy for a zoo that had been abandoned for years. It stood there like a barrier, the final wall between me and whatever had been kept inside. A faded sign hung above it, too worn to read, but the words that remained were enough to make my blood run cold. Containment area. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Containment? Was it possible that the creature I had seen, the one that had followed me, was just the beginning? The growls, the eyes, the whispers, they all pointed to something far darker than I had imagined. This wasn't just a zoo. This was a place designed to hold something alive and far beyond the natural. I approached the door, the cold air around me thickening. The rusted lock on the door seemed to pulse, as if reacting to my presence, and my hand shook as I pulled out my key ring, searching for the right key. The lock was old, but it still functioned, clicking open with a satisfying snap. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing the room beyond. The air inside was thick with the smell of rot, and I could feel a chill settle into my bones as I stepped forward. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carvings and markings that seemed to pulse with life, as though they had been etched in blood. The room was dark, but there was something in the center, something that caught the dim light of my flashlight. I moved toward it slowly, my breath shallow, my pulse racing. It was a large glass tank, empty, except for the strange residue that lined its base. The tank itself was enormous, far too large for a typical zoo exhibit, and the markings around it were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Symbols, runes, ancient, as if they had been carved into the very foundation of the building. There were no animals here, no cages, only this tank and the strange energy that filled the room. I knelt beside the tank, the feeling of dread intensifying. The markings around the tank were familiar, too familiar. I realized with a shock that they were identical to the ones I had found in the hidden room, the ones carved into the crate. The symbols were all part of a ritual to contain something. And that was when I saw it. In the far corner of the tank, beneath the glass, there was something moving. I could barely make it out at first, just a flicker of shadow, a glimpse of movement. But as I focused, I saw it more clearly. A figure, distorted and writhing, its shape constantly shifting. It was large, its body stretching and morphing, its limbs twisted in unnatural ways. Its face, or what I could make of it, was a grotesque mass of eyes and mouths, all blinking and twisting as if trying to communicate with me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure in the tank was alive, and it was not human. The growls from outside the building returned, louder this time, and I could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath me. The creature in the tank was awakening, and whatever it wasn't meant to be free. I could feel it pulling at me, the darkness inside the tank calling to me, trying to drag me closer. The walls seemed to close in, the whispers louder than ever, urging me to stay, urging me to witness the final unveiling of the thing that had been locked away for so long. I couldn't stay. I couldn't allow it to be free. But the power of the zoo, of the creature, was too strong. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. The glass of the tank cracked slightly, the faintest sound of something ancient breaking free. The markings on the walls flared to life, glowing with an unearthly light, and the creature, it, let out a deafening roar that rattled the very foundations of the zoo. The growls outside intensified, and the air seemed to vibrate with the energy of something ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment for centuries. And then, with a final, gut-wrenching crack, the tank shattered. The creature broke free.